Recently, my office indicted an illegal immigrant named Ishmael Ortega Hernandez for the murder of his girlfriend in front of her 2 children. He sought refuge in a sanctuary city because politicians like Representatives Grijalva and Ansari have made people believe that they are safe in those cities. I'm here to let you know that they are not. There are no sanctuary cities in Arizona. With this partnership, if you commit a crime in Pinal County, we will hunt you down no matter where you go and prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. Human smuggling is an evil, and we will not only prosecute those who participate in such activities, but my office is also planning to pursue legislation to call it what it is. It's modern day.
So you hear him say it, and your stomach just drops because you know what this is about. You know the whole apparatus is right there in his words, like a confession wrapped in law enforcement rhetoric, wrapped in tough guy posturing, Brad Miller standing there saying, "We will hunt you down no matter where you go," and using one murder to justify an entire regime of surveillance and terror against Latino communities across Arizona. One case becomes the justification for everything that comes after, because that's how the dehumanization playbook has always worked in America. And let me tell you, what's happening right now in this very moment across Arizona and beyond is nothing short of a constitutional crisis wrapped in the language of public safety, and you need to understand the scale and the coordination and the absolute systematic nature of what's being constructed, because Pinal County Attorney's Office is the only local agency in Arizona to sign a task force agreement, since ICE revived them in January, and that task force model is the most aggressive version of the 287G program, where local officers serve as a force multiplier in federal immigration enforcement during routine police duties, which means every traffic stop, every interaction, every moment of contact becomes a potential deportation pipeline, and this is happening while Tayez has been arresting roughly 1,000 and 1,100 people per day in recent weeks, with a daily arrest average between January 20 and October 15 of 2021. But here's what they don't tell you in those press conferences where they brag about keeping communities safe. But nearly 75,000 people with no criminal records have been swept up in immigration operations that the president and his top officials said would target murderers, rapists, and gang members, so the rhetoric and the reality are catastrophically divergent, and you're watching Miller deploy the oldest trick in the authoritarian handbook, which is take one heinous crime committed by one person and use it to criminalize an entire community. The bombshell here that should make every single person who cares about civil liberties absolutely furious is that Arizona law enforcement agencies are largely rejecting this fast-growing IC program, citing the experience of Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, which was booted from the program in 2009 after a federal judge found deputies racially profiled and violated the constitutional rights of Latinas. So even in Arizona, even in places that lean conservative, the memory of Joe Arpaio's reign of terror is so visceral that sheriffs are saying no thank you. We remember what happened when we turned local law enforcement into deportation agents, but Miller is charging ahead anyway, and when you look at the Arizona ICE Act that passed through the legislature earlier this year, you see the infrastructure being built for mass surveillance and mass deportation, because Senate Bill 1164 prohibits state government entities from interfering with federal immigration authorities and forces public employees at places like schools and libraries to cooperate with immigration enforcement, preventing them from enacting policies to protect privacy, which means nowhere is safe, no institution is protected, and the entire state apparatus becomes an extension of ICE. Here's where it gets even more chilling, and you need to sit with this for a moment, because the implications are staggering. At the start of 2025, 135 local law enforcement agencies throughout the United States had signed 287 GRAM agreements, and now over 1,000 agencies have signed on. So we're watching in real time the construction of the largest domestic deportation infrastructure in American history, and Miller is proudly participating in this machinery, and when he talks about hunting people down, what he's really talking about is a system where ICE raids in 2025 focus 76% on majority Latino neighborhoods, which is just racial profiling with a badge and federal authorization, and the Supreme Court has now given them permission to do this because the recent Supreme Court decision allows ICE to profile Americans based on perceptions that they look like an immigrant, raising serious concerns that Latino citizens and long-term residents may face increased targeting. So even if you're a citizen, even if your family has been here for generations, even if you've done absolutely nothing wrong, you're now subject to detention and interrogation based on how you look and where you live and what language you speak. The consequences of this are cascading through communities right now, and I want you to understand the human cost because high percentages of Latino citizens are avoiding important activities, including being engaged in their children's schools and reporting crimes to police for fear of being asked for their immigration papers. In Charlotte, 15% of kids in one school district didn't show up to school this week because families are terrified, and about 47% of Latinos now worry that they or someone close to them could be deported, up from 42% earlier in 2025. So you're creating a climate of fear so pervasive that it's disrupting education, disrupting public health, disrupting public safety itself. Because when immigrant communities don't trust law enforcement, crime goes unreported, witnesses don't come forward, and everyone is less safe. But that's not what Miller cares about. He cares about the performance of toughness. He cares about standing at that podium and saying there are no sanctuary cities in Arizona, and if you commit a crime in Pinal County, we will hunt you down. And notice how he slides from talking about one murder case to talking about human smuggling, to talking about hunting people down anywhere they go, as if these are all the same thing, as if seeking refuge in a city with sanctuary policies makes you a criminal deserving of being hunted. And let's talk about sanctuary cities for a moment, because Miller specifically calls out representatives by name, saying they made people believe they are safe in sanctuary cities, and he's here to let you know they are not. And this is deeply sinister because sanctuary cities are jurisdictions that prioritize the safety and well-being of all residents by limiting cooperation with federal immigration authorities, allowing limited local resources to be used to support local community members. There is no established relationship between sanctuary status and crime rates, but there is evidence that when local law enforcement and ICE work together, it reduces the likelihood of immigrant and Latino communities to report crimes. So sanctuary policies actually make communities safer, but Miller is attacking them as if they're enabling criminals, when in reality they're protecting constitutional rights and community trust in law enforcement. The research is absolutely clear on this, but it doesn't matter because the point isn't safety. The point is subordination. The point is sending a message to Latino communities that you are always suspect, always deportable, always one interaction away from having your life destroyed. Videos from sanctuary jurisdictions, including Chicago, California, and Worcester, Massachusetts, showed local police acting more like auxiliary enforcers. So even sanctuary policies are being undermined by the culture of immigration enforcement that's bleeding into local policing. What Miller is doing and what's happening across Arizona right now is part of a coordinated national campaign, and you can see it in the timing and the rhetoric, because Homeland Security officials started broadcasting a plan to target sanctuary jurisdictions from the start of President Trump's second term, putting local leaders directly at odds with Trump's mass deportation campaign. The Trump administration has swelled the number of deals between ICE and local law enforcement to more than 1,000 agreements across the country, and they're using financial incentives because, starting in October, ICE began reimbursing local agencies with task force agreements for the salaries of certified officers and paying performance awards of up to $1,000 per officer. So they're literally paying police departments to become deportation agents, creating a profit motive for immigration enforcement, which is grotesque and dystopian, and should alarm anyone who thinks law enforcement should serve communities, not federal deportation quotas. But here's the thing that should keep you up at night, and I want you to really absorb this. This is the core of the mass deportation strategy. They know they can't arrest 11 million people, so they try to scare as many of them as possible out of living their lives in the United States, in the hopes that they'll give up and deport themselves. So the cruelty is the point. The fear is the policy, and Miller, standing there bragging about hunting people down, is participating in what amounts to a campaign of state-sponsored terror against immigrant communities, because when you make people afraid to send their kids to school, afraid to go to work, afraid to call the police when they're victims of crime, afraid to exist in public spaces, you're not making anyone safe, you're just exercising power over vulnerable populations and calling it law and order. And we need to be absolutely precise about who this targets, because a growing number of U.S. citizens, many of them Latinos, are reporting they were detained for various periods by immigration agents in what critics say were instances of racial profiling, and reports of citizens of Latino descent being detained or stopped and asked to prove citizenship are rippling through Latino communities nationwide. And people often carry passports or proof of citizenship at all times, even if they are U.S. citizens, to avoid wrongful detention, and according to reports, some U.S. citizens of Latino descent have been detained or asked to prove their status during raids. So we're talking about American citizens being forced to carry papers proving their citizenship because they have brown skin or Spanish surnames. And if that doesn't make you think of every authoritarian regime in history, then you haven't been paying attention, because demanding papers from people based on how they look is literally the definition of a police state. The language Miller uses is revealing in ways he probably doesn't even realize, because when he says human smuggling is evil, and they will call it what it is, modern-day slavery, he's appropriating the language of human rights to justify a system that actually perpetuates harm. And let's be clear about what's actually happening at the border and in immigration enforcement, because the conditions in ICE detention are brutal and documented, and families are being separated, and people are being deported to countries where they face persecution and violence. But Miller wants to wrap himself in the rhetoric of fighting slavery while participating in a system that ICE has begun arresting people at and near immigration courts in Phoenix and Tucson, sometimes outside the building or following traffic stops. So they're not even waiting for people to have their day in court. They're arresting people who are trying to comply with the legal process, who are showing up for their court dates, because the goal isn't justice. The goal is maximizing deportation numbers. And let's talk about those deportation numbers for a moment, because the Trump administration has been lying about them, and we have the receipts because DHS claims of record arrests and deportations never materialized, and they announced in April that arrests and deportations had already surpassed the entirety of fiscal year 2024. But these claims were not simply untrue, but preposterous, as Biden's actual FY 2024 record of 270,000 removals was over twice DHS's claimed number of 135,000 removals, and the Trump administration's actual number was only around 72,000 removals. So they're fabricating statistics to create the appearance of success, while terrorizing communities, and Miller is participating in this apparatus and presenting it as if it's about one murder case, about keeping communities safe when it's actually about constructing a deportation pipeline, operates with minimal oversight and maximal cruelty. The historical echoes here should be deafening, because we've seen this before in Arizona, specifically with Joe Arpaio. Arpaio conducted broad sweeps of Latino neighborhoods and arrested high numbers of undocumented individuals who had committed no criminal offenses, and the DOJ conducted an investigation, which led to ICE failing to renew its 287 agreement with Arpaio's agency, and Miller knows this history. Everyone in Arizona law enforcement knows this history, and he's choosing to repeat it anyway, because he thinks this time will be different, or more likely because he doesn't care about the constitutional violations, as long as he gets to perform toughness at press conferences. The fact that, even in Republican-led communities known for backing immigration measures, law enforcement leaders are steering clear of ICE's 287 Grime Task Force program, which the Trump administration is using to enlist local officers in its mass deportation efforts, tells you that this is so extreme, so constitutionally suspect, so operationally dangerous, that even conservative sheriffs are saying no, but Miller is saying yes. What we're witnessing right now in Arizona and across the country is the normalization of racial profiling at scale and transformation of every public institution into a potential site of immigration enforcement, and Miller's press conference is just one data point in a much larger pattern, but it's an important one because he's not hiding what he's doing, he's bragging about it. He's using the language of hunting and law and order and protecting communities, while participating in a system that officials billed as targeting the worst of the worst criminal aliens, but more than 370 people were arrested, only 44 of whom had any prior criminal record, so the vast majority of people being arrested have no criminal history, but they're being swept up anyway because the mandate is to hit numbers to fill detention beds to feed the deportation machine. And here's what should galvanize everyone watching this into action, because this isn't inevitable, this isn't the natural order of things, this is a policy choice, and the resistance unfolding in places like Boone and Harlan suggests that America's political fault lines are shifting, and the coming deportation raids were supposed to be a mop-up operation executed in the heart of real America, but instead they are turning into a slog met with 1,000 cuts of small-town rebellions, so people are fighting back, communities are organizing, and even in places you wouldn't expect there's resistance to this cruelty. Mayors and local officials aren't just criticizing ICE raids in their cities, they're making life harder for federal law enforcement while being careful not to go over the line, and cities are finding ways to push back on unwanted immigration enforcement by the Trump administration. So there are tools available, there are strategies being deployed, there are ways to resist, but Miller wants to foreclose all of that. He wants Arizona to be the place where there are no sanctuary cities, where there is no refuge, where local law enforcement is fully integrated into the federal deportation apparatus, and he's using the murder of one woman to justify a system that will harm thousands of families. And let's be absolutely clear that the murder he's talking about is a tragedy, and the person who committed it should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but using that tragedy to attack sanctuary cities and specific elected officials by name and to justify a partnership with ICE that will inevitably lead to racial profiling and wrongful detention and family separation is exploitative and dishonest and deeply dangerous. Victims of crime deserve justice, but justice doesn't look like terrorizing entire communities based on their ethnicity or immigration status. And when you create a climate where immigrant communities are afraid to interact with law enforcement, you make it harder to solve crimes, harder to protect victims, harder to build the trust that actual public safety requires. The language about hunting people down is particularly chilling when you consider what that actually means in practice, because immigration agents arrested and detained 8 people at a dairy farm in Berkshire, which was at the time the largest known immigration raid in Vermont history, and it's since been eclipsed multiple times, so raids are escalating in scale and frequency. 2 Taco Giro locations in Tucson were among those federal agents raided Friday, prompting protests, including one in which Democratic Representative Adelita Grijalva was hit with pepper spray. So they're raiding restaurants, they're raiding farms, they're raiding workplaces, and using force against protesters and elected officials who try to document what's happening. This is what hunting people down looks like in practice, and it's violent and it's disruptive, and it tears apart the fabric of communities, and Miller is proud of it. We need to talk about the broader context here because what's happening in Arizona is happening everywhere, and the immigration enforcement operation launched in Louisiana is pitting New Orleans' sanctuary city policies against state laws favored by Republican lawmakers, and Operation Catahoula Crunch is the latest in a series of escalations unfolding in Democratic-led cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis. So the Trump administration is systematically targeting cities that have tried to protect their residents, and using them as examples and deploying massive resources to conduct raids that are designed as much for their symbolic value as for their enforcement value, because the point of this is to be visible, and they want us talking about it, and more importantly, they want immigrants to be afraid. So the cruelty is performative, it's meant to send a message, and Miller is participating in that performance. And when Miller talks about pursuing legislation to call human smuggling modern-day slavery, he's revealing the game because he's trying to attach the moral weight of anti-slavery rhetoric to immigration enforcement, which is obscene when you consider that border crossings have plummeted, ICE arrests have doubled, and the number of people in detention is at an all-time high. So we're detaining more people than ever before in conditions that are often inhumane, and calling it anti-slavery when actually the detention industrial complex is a form of coerced confinement that profits private prison companies and exploits detained migrants who are often paid pennies per hour for labor they perform in detention facilities. So if you want to talk about modern slavery, let's talk about the actual conditions in ICE detention, not use that language as a cudgel to justify more enforcement. The representatives Miller calls out by name are doing the work of protecting their communities, and when he says they made people believe they are safe in sanctuary cities, he's attacking the very concept of sanctuary, which has deep roots in religious and moral tradition going back centuries, because the idea that there should be places of refuge, places where people can be safe from persecution, places where human dignity is prioritized over enforcement, has been a part of human society forever, but Miller wants to eliminate that. He wants nowhere to be safe. He wants every jurisdiction to be hostile territory for immigrants, and that's a radical and extreme position that's being presented as common-sense law and order. What we need right now is clarity about what's at stake, because this isn't about one murder case, and it isn't about public safety, and it isn't about rule of law. This is about power and control, and the deliberate cultivation of fear in Latino communities to serve a political agenda, and researchers note that this constant feeling of being hunted has really serious implications for people's physical and their mental health. So we're talking about public health crisis, we're talking about psychological trauma, we're talking about children who are growing up afraid that their parents will be taken away, and families that are being torn apart, and communities that are being destabilized, all in the name of enforcement that doesn't actually make anyone safer. Miller standing at that podium saying "we will hunt you down" is telling you exactly who he is and what he's about, and we need to believe him, and we need to respond accordingly because this ruling destabilizes public safety itself, as real safety requires trust between communities and law enforcement, and when entire neighborhoods fear that an accent, a workplace, or a face is enough to trigger detention cooperation, evaporates, so everything Miller claims to care about is undermined by the very policies he's championing. But that's because the stated goals and the actual goals are different. The stated goal is public safety, but the actual goal is demographic control and political performance, and the subordination of Latino communities. This moment requires us to be absolutely unequivocal in our opposition, because what Miller is describing, what Arizona is implementing, what the Trump administration is coordinating, is un-American in the deepest sense. It violates constitutional principles, it violates human rights norms, it violates the values we claim to hold dear, and it does so while wrapping itself in the language of law and order, and public safety, and we cannot let that rhetorical move succeed. We need to call this what it is, which is state-sponsored persecution of immigrant communities facilitated by local law enforcement, enabled by federal policy, justified by cherry-picked anecdotes and implemented through racial profiling, and we need to resist it at every level with every tool available, because the alternative is accepting a country where entire communities live in fear, where constitutional rights are conditional based on how you look, where local institutions become arms of federal deportation machinery, and where hunting human beings is something prosecutors brag about in press conferences. That's not the country we should accept, and it's not the country we have to accept, and the fight against this cruelty and this injustice is the fight of our time, and Miller just told us exactly what side he's on.